Okay, so I'd just like to welcome everybody here today, and particularly I'd love to welcome Professor John Eade. John is coming to us from the University of Roehampton today, and he'll be talking on the topic of the reinvention of pilgrimage places and routes in a mobile world. So I suppose just to give a brief introduction to Professor John Eade, John is Professor of Sociology and Anthropology at the University of Roehampton. He's also a visiting professor at Toronto University and is the former Executive Director of CRONAM, which is the Centre for Research on Nationalism, Ethnicity and Multiculturalism. He co-founded two book series, the Routledge series on religion, travel and tourism, and the Ashgate series on pilgrimage. He is a co-editor of the Bloomsbury Religion, Space and Place series, and in 2018 he co-founded the European Association of Social Anthropologists Pilgrimage Network, PILNET. He's currently working with Professor George Duerschmidt, University of Applied Sciences in Ludwigsburg, and Professor Marco Caselli from the Catholic University of Milan on a project funded by the Volkswagen Stiftung called State Capacity and the Capacity to Aspire, the Corona Pandemic as a Testing Ground of Local Migrant Integration, Stuttgart, London and Milan. The project began in March 2021 and will end on September 2022. From 2015 to 2018, John was a member of the Management Committee on the AHRC Research Cathedrals and Pilgrimage Project. So without further ado, I'll hand it over to yourself, John. So thank you very much to everybody, and thanks to you as well, John.
Thank you, Ian. Yeah, I'd like to dedicate this talk to Father Michael Hayes, who was chaplain here at Roehampton and then came to you and very sadly died at the age of 60. So this is in his memory. Okay, Carly, if you could move to the first slide, please. Yeah. Okay. I just want to remind us that there are three types of pilgrimage in Christian history. We tend to focus on place pilgrimage, you know, travel to and from a sacred place and staying at the place. But there are two other important types of pilgrimage going right back to the beginning of Christianity. The kind of inner journey where you don't have to necessarily move anywhere. And this, of course, is very much the focus of monastic centers that were a feature of early Christianity, going to the desert and living in total isolation. And the other is a moral journey, which is like Bunyan's Pilgrim's Progress. But today I'm going to focus on place pilgrimage. So if we have the second slide, please, Carly. Okay. Just remind us that formal religious observance has steadily declined across Europe. Although, of course, there's been important growth amongst other groups within Christianity, Pentecostals, for example, Muslims, Hindus, Sikhs, Buddhists, Jains, etc. And of course, this very much reflects the impact of global migration on the region that I'm going to focus on, which is Europe. So although there's been decline in formal observance, there's been a massive increase in people going to Christian pilgrimage shrines. And for example, okay, the numbers may be dodgy, but it's claimed that in the early 2020s, people visiting Lourdes, around 7 million, people visiting Assisi, famous shrine of St. Francis, 6 million, Padua, Antony of Padua, 5 million, Lisieux, St. Therese, 2 million, and Fatima over 1 million. So clearly pilgrimage shrines are a big draw. And of course, besides those very famous international centers, of course we can include Rome as well, there are national, regional and local shrines. Very often people tend to ignore them, but they have always formed a very important supplement or accompanying the big international pilgrimages. And of course, this is very much linked to the expansion of travel and tourism. And there's a very long debate about how pilgrimage and tourism is interwoven, and how important it is to not just separate pilgrims from tourists. I was talking very briefly to a colleague of mine, Nick Mayhew-Smith, and he was pointing out that in the Middle Ages, people on these journeys were engaged in all kinds of things besides devout religion. Just look at Chaucer's famous Canterbury Tales. Clearly, rather than pilgrimage and tourism being separate, they are mutually interwoven. So the next shrine, So this is just a visual of Lourdes, and what you can see here, of course, is the great emphasis upon mass celebration. This particular pilgrimage emerged in 1858 as part of a tradition of a young woman, in this case Bernadette Subaru, having a series of visions with Our Lady Mary, Mother of Jesus, and around this developed what is now, as we can see before, a multi-million visiting shrine with enormous support structure, as well as the whole area being transformed by the building of these three basilicas, two of which you can see before you. So let's move on to the next shrine, the next slide. And this is another example of St. Antony of Padua shrine. So clearly what these are showing is the ways in which imposing buildings have been erected and welcoming the many millions that come. And of course, I'm sure many people listening to this talk will know that they are containing all kinds of relics associated with the saint, as well as a whole range of ex-votos of given by people who are grateful for miraculous cures. And of course, going back to Lourdes, Lourdes has two facets. One is the message that the church wished to kind of emphasize, which is Mary disclosing herself as the Immaculate Conception. The Vatican kind of seized on this because it fitted the dogmatic proclamations of the church. But for many people, it's the spring that was unveiled during the apparitions and their assumed miraculous curative power. So this is part of a long tradition of Catholic pilgrimage where people come for all kinds of reasons, not just narrowly theological ones that fit the church's pronouncements. Okay, the next slide, please. Now, let's look at Protestant pilgrimage. This is very interesting, of course, because as we know, pilgrimage shrines were demolished in the 16th century, and pilgrimage went into abeyance until the late 19th, early 20th century. They were revived in England by Irish Catholic migration, but within the Church of England itself, there were important changes, and Walsingham demonstrates those changes very vividly. So, for example, Walsingham, a small village in East Anglia, there's a Church of England shrine that was set up in the 1920s, 30s by high Anglican priest. A mile outside, there's the Slippered Chapel, which is a Roman Catholic shrine, and there's also an Orthodox chapel in Little Walsingham, a neighbouring village. So we have three Christian shrines, locations, drawing people from different backgrounds. Not without controversy, actually, because Ian Paisley, who I'm sure many of you will know, led a group of people demonstrating against the kind of papist influence on the Church of England shrine. Saw this as quite unacceptable. But generally, the village and the shrine do their business without any major contestation. So it's estimated about 310,000 come to the Church of England shrine, and about 100,000 also come to the Slipper Chapel, the Catholic shrine. So, you know, probably about 500,000 people come to this small village tucked away in East Anglia. But also English cathedrals have deliberately revived medieval shrines. Often there are no real traces, so they have to kind of reinvent the shrines. And for example, Canterbury, Thomas Becket, who was beatified, his shrine was so effectively smashed, they don't really know exactly where it is. But this reflects the kind of ways in which cathedrals have become important magnets for people, and people coming for all kinds of reasons, not necessarily religious at all. Some people want to come and listen to the beautiful singing, the playing of the organ, the beauty of the building, or kind of aesthetic. And of course, religious people can also, you know, have all kinds of motives. One of the features of pilgrimage research is how mixed people's motives are, how complex they are, and how they change over time, actually. A lot of research tends to be snapshot, just doing a one-year study, but as I know myself, because I've worked at Lourdes over a 40-year period, and my views about going there have changed a lot over that period. And of course, if you just ask someone at one stage in their life, you may get a very different view from if you ask them, say, 10 years later or 20 years later. Okay, so the next slide, please. And as you can see, it's a very English scene, half-timbered houses there. And here we have an Anglican procession with all the kind of banners and regalia celebrating the devotion to Our Lady. So it's very much an example of Marian devotion, but in a non-Catholic Anglican setting. And of course, typically people watching what's going on as well. So processions are a very important aspect of pilgrimage. And also I ought to mention that many people talk about peregrination, the way in which, in fact, relics, icons can move around, so they don't actually have to stay in one place. And this is very much a tradition in Eastern Europe, in Russia. And so, for example, in Poland, during the socialist period, the icon, the famous icon of Mary and Jesus at Czestochowa, which is a major Marian shrine, was taken around the country as a way of bolstering Polish Catholic resistance to the socialist state regime. So next slide, please. And this is a late 19th century statue of Our Lady and Child. Yellow, white and blue, associated obviously with the colours of Our Lady. So next slide, please. And this, of course, is an iconic picture. Canterbury Cathedral, as I said earlier, St. Thomas Becket's shrine was so thoroughly demolished that the cathedrals had to start again. And the project that Ian mentioned that when he's introducing me, the Cathedrals and Pilgrimage Project, chose the Canterbury as one of 4 cathedrals where they were tracking the way in which pilgrimage was deliberately reinvented by the cathedral officials, and Canterbury, Durham, York, 3 major Anglican cathedrals were chosen for the project. Interestingly enough, Westminster Cathedral, which is the Roman Catholic cathedral, was also chosen. And when the team went there, the officials the official they spoke to in Westminster Cathedral was a bit kind of taken aback by talking to him about pilgrimage. He hadn't really thought of the cathedral as a site of pilgrimage. He emphasized very much we're a working cathedral, and it's ironic because there are many bones of saints in that cathedral, so they have almost a surfeit of bones. It's almost as if they you know, take it for granted in a way, whereas in Canterbury there are no bones of St. Thomas Becket, as far as I know. Okay, next slide. Okay, I think it's important also to think about the way that shrines are shared. They aren't the exclusive property of a particular religious church or a particular religious devotees. And we can see in West European shrines, let's look beyond England for now, there's increasing diversity of those who are visiting these shrines. People pop in, you know, all kinds of reasons of people walking in the area, people interested, just curious to see what's going on. And in fact, I was looking at people's reactions to Lourdes on one of these websites, and one of the visitors, who clearly wasn't a Catholic, said, "Well, this is a funny place. There are lots of people singing something around here and walking around." They obviously had no real idea what the shrine was about, but interested. And I think this also refers to what I talked about before, between what we call pilgrims and tourists, and people's motives cannot be so easily demarcated. And Lourdes is a very good example of that, because clearly people come to Lourdes, they may be involved in the rituals, but also they go to the cafes. They can get drunk in an evening and act in all kinds of ways that the priests may not be very approving of. So this mixture is what we are so interested in as researchers. And this has led to people coining various kind of hybrids to try and convey this mixture. So people talk about pilgrimage tourism, religious tourism, or spiritual tourism. And of course, this is linked to the development of shops and visitor centres, which you can see at shrines and inside cathedrals. Very often people coming to Lourdes express kind of horror at the whole range of shops that lead down to the perimeter of the sanctuary. So there's this kind of tradition somehow that commerce and religion don't go together, whereas historically we know that they do. I suppose this reflects the kind of New Testament story of Jesus throwing out the moneylenders in the temple, that kind of notion that there has to be a very sharp separation between commerce on the one hand and religion on the other. So next slide, please. And this is an example of what some people regard as awful, mawkish, commercialism gone mad. But I think we shouldn't be moralistic about it. We should be interested in it. This is from a Black Madonna shrine in Einsiedeln near Zurich in Switzerland that I visited. And the shop was massive. And this is just one section of various saints and You can see Mary there, for example, and below it, all kinds of nice little things that are not religious. So you get the mixture of the narrow religious and the more broadly popular secular, if you like. And the various things hanging from the walls that you can also hang, like moons and suns and things like that. Okay, so next slide. Now, it's important, as I said before, to understand that shrines are reflecting the changing multicultural character of Europe, and we can see this vividly across Western Europe, in particular, where global migration has had a big impact. So West European shrines are clearly attracting Hindus, Buddhists, Muslims from minority communities. You know, for them, this is a sacred place. Okay, it might be Christian, but it's still holy, it's still sacred, it has a sacred power. And for example, at Lourdes, this attracts Hindus and Buddhists from India and Sri Lanka originally. For example, I did a lot of work in the baths where people come to bathe in the water, and French Tamil group coming from Paris. Families come where some are Catholics and some are Hindus, so but they all come as a family to bathe, which makes an interesting issue for helpers like us, because clearly for Catholics there's this kind of standard ritual which you can't impose upon Hindu bathers. So it's quite tricky trying to differentiate without making people uncomfortable. Also, Fatima, who was the daughter of Muhammad, founder of Islam. Fatima in Portugal is a Marian shrine, but it attracts Muslim visitors, particularly women, actually. The gendering of pilgrimage is very, very important. And Cordoba, which of course originally was a mosque, became Catholic after the Reconquista, or the gradual expulsion of Muslim rulers and the conversion, often forced, of Muslims to Catholicism, and Jews as well, actually. And sometimes there's been tension at Cordoba, for example, when Muslims and others want to perform their own rituals within the shrine. So a good example of the contested nature of pilgrimage, actually. So the next slide actually shows Cordoba, I think. Yes, there we are. So it's fascinating. I don't know if anyone's been there. I visited it, and as you can see, this is a typical Islamic architecture, and they plonked a altar in the middle of it, but it doesn't make any architectural sense because there's no kind of lead up. So it's not like a Gothic cathedral where everything leads towards the high altar. So this attempt to kind of Catholicize the building is quite constrained by the architecture. And of course, it's not going to be destroyed and started again, although some mosques as well as churches have been destroyed and rebuilt in the style of the particular faith. Okay, next slide. This is a fascinating example of new Muslim pilgrimage. This is in Nuneaton, which is near Coventry in the Midlands. And this is a shrine built in honor of a particular Muslim divine who died there. And the style you see is very South Asian. If you didn't know where this was, you might think it was in Pakistan or India. But no, it's in bang in the middle of in the Midlands of England. And here are people coming on pilgrimage to commemorate the anniversary of the saint's death. So this is a very controversial area, of course, within Islam, where saint devotion, which has a long history, linked to Sufism has often been a source of attack. So these shrines in Pakistan and Middle East have actually been attacked by those who see them as totally unacceptable and not part of the Islamic tradition. Okay, next shrine. Next slide. And this is a wonderful example. This is the Ganesh ceremony, the elephant god, who is being ceremoniously dumped in the River Mersey. So the River Mersey becomes the equivalent of the Ganges for this ritual. And it shows the way in which British Hindus, now we have 3-4 generations here, are sacralizing the English landscape for their own purposes, for their own traditions. And of course, the Lord Mayor and all the other dignitaries turn up because they welcome this as a multicultural event. So they've got an interesting way of which a religious event becomes fitted in within the multicultural agenda of the English political system. So next slide, please. Now, this is often a contested issue, the use of the term New Age, but I think it reflects the greater range of interest in pilgrimage beyond what is seen as the narrowly religious institutional context. So a lot of people influenced by Buddhism and Hinduism and belief systems from the East, let's call it, they would describe themselves not as religious pilgrims, but as spiritual pilgrims. So the term spiritual has become used in a whole variety of ways to describe what some people call alternative pilgrimage. But anyway, it shows the diversity that pilgrimage, that is shaping pilgrimage, not only in England, but right across Europe. So Glastonbury, for example, brings together Anglicans, Roman Catholics, New Age, pagan, Wicca, Celtic pilgrims. It's particularly interesting, I suppose, talking in the context of Limerick, because Celtic pilgrimage has become quite popular because it's seen as a more indigenous form. It's not Roman, it's not imposed by missionaries being sent by the Pope, but has, you know, a kind of indigenous tradition that, of course, the Vatican wished to demolish. So, for example, monasteries brought together both monks and nuns in the Celtic church. And of course, this was eventually abolished. But also all kinds of forms of popular pilgrimage. And again, it's easy to be elitist about this. People might, you know, think this is not serious pilgrimage, but to the people themselves, it's very serious. So Jimmy Szabo, a major figure in Hungary, where he's buried, attracts a lot of devotees. Jim Morrison's tomb in the cemetery in Paris. And even on the way to work here, there is a little shrine to Mark Bolan, who was killed in a car accident just down the road from where I'm talking, actually. And this, I think, links to the way in which routes are open to all comers, and this particularly this has been associated with the increasing popularity of the Camino, the various routes that lead to Santiago de Compostela, which of course was a very important medieval shrine, but went into rapid decline in the 17th, 18th, 19th century, and largely has been revived by Galician commercial interests, as well as the church. And also, it has to be said, during the Franco regime, General Franco went to Santiago to celebrate the devotion to Santiago. And St. James, or Santiago, again, is controversial because there are many statues of him killing Muslims. He's known as the Matamoros, the slayer of the non-Christians, and of course this doesn't fit the kind of open, welcoming, ecumenical tradition now. So this is quietly kind of put aside, and it's the statue of him with the copper shell and the various other hat and staff that are usually popularized. And of course, not just this, but of course there are other pilgrimage routes that are down to Italy, for example, that are being revived. And I think the next slide shows the enormous range of, oh, that's Glastonbury Abbey, that's what it was like. As you see, not much left of it. We'll come to the routes slide in a minute, perhaps. So next slide, please, Carly. And these are the ruins, what's left of Glastonbury Abbey after the Reformation. Not much, as you can see, but is the site for, I'm not sure whether this, I think this is an Anglican pilgrimage. So these are people drawn to the original site of the Abbey. So next slide, please. This is the sacred Thorn. This is all part of legend, of course, Camelot and all that. And in the background is the famous Tor, the hill with the tower at the top. Which is, so these images have become quite iconic. And in fact, I think someone actually took a chainsaw to the Thorn and cut it down. Obviously, some people didn't agree with this devotion to this tree, so they had to replant it. So makes for quite an interesting issue about authenticity, you know, what's the original when things are continually reinvented as they have to be. Okay, next slide, please. And this is Mark Boland's shrine. As you can see, various pictures of him and flowers, and there's even a statue of the head of him. His lyrics attracted the kind of new age musical devotee, and here's one of them standing by the shrine. As I say, this is on my cycle route back to my home, and so I've seen it over the years develop, despite some people saying just get rid of it, you know, the guy's dead, so what's all the fuss about? But clearly some of his followers see this as a very important place of commemoration. Next slide, please. So we can also see the important revitalization of old pilgrimage routes. So some are the original routes, but of course many are reinvented routes. So when I say revitalization, we can't necessarily think of them as the original routes. And I think we can understand this economically, the increasing leisure time, growth of third age retired people. You know, a lot of us are living longer than we were and fairly fit and want to go on walking tours. It also fits in with notions of well-being, slow living, slow cooking, for example. And of course, the Camino, the routes across Santiago to Santiago across France and northern Spain, have also received important institutional support. So the European Union has promoted the routes as a symbol of European unity. So that really is interesting, given Brexit, and where does England fit into that? And UNESCO also has celebrated the Camino as a World Heritage Site. So it's clearly a combination of things. And the people sharing the route range in all kinds of interests and motivations and backgrounds. So religiously inspired, spiritual, new age, travelers, hikers, all kinds of people kind of coexist and often share the same hostel at the end of the day and exchange their stories about what's been happening and, you know, how damaged their feet are and all that kind of thing. And of course, it's been very much promoted by mass media. The success of books like Paulo Coelho's, the Brazilian kind of mystical writer, Shirley MacLaine, the famous Hollywood movie star, Martin Sheen, another Hollywood movie star who made a very successful film called The Way. So the Camino benefits from a whole range of promoters, if you like, institutional, mass media, and again, providing a kind of open road where people can do their own thing, if you like. So the next slide, please. Yeah, so this is one I referred to earlier. As you see, these are all routes, all coming down to the French border and then tracking along to Santiago. But although we can talk about the red route, as you can see, there are all kinds of routes coming up from Spain, from Portugal, coming up from Italy, coming down from Germany, and going further afield, of course, to Poland, to the Baltic states. And nicely in this representation, before Brexit, England is shown there as playing a very important role historically, but even today in terms of the revitalization of the Camino routes. Okay, next slide, please. And coming to the end of my talk now, and hopefully we might have some time for questions, but what's also interesting is that in Scandinavia, there are all kinds of routes that have also been invented. And this is a very good example of routes across Norway, but coming from Sweden. In the top right there, you see Östersund, or however you pronounce that, going down to Trondheim, which the cathedral there is associated with Saint Olav, who is seen as the patron saint of Norway. So, and you can see other routes coming up from Oslo, and there's even an interesting maritime pilgrimage here, which is not studied very much, but Adriana, who is actually sitting next to me here, is visiting from Croatia, and she's working on a pioneering maritime pilgrimage project, looking at a Croatian pilgrimage to an island associated with Our Lady, so Marian Shrine, but not just that, of course, linking to colleagues in other countries as well. And of course, Ireland has a strong tradition of maritime pilgrimage, but interesting enough, people haven't really studied it. They preferred to stay on dry land, maybe reflects certain kind of queasiness about being rocking away on the waters of the sea. So this is an important slide because clearly Norway was deeply affected by the Protestant Reformation, and pilgrimage, quite surprisingly to many Norwegians, has sprung up again. And St. Bridget is a famous Swedish saint, and her shrine at Westem, which is on a lake, which is not, you can't see it on this slide, but Pope John Paul made her one of 3 patron saints of Europe, actually. And I must say it was very powerful when I visited there on a conference to look at this, what appeared to me quite an isolated place, but in fact was part of a very live medieval network of pilgrimages. So the next slide. And this is also a good example of what I was talking about before. of a new route that is funded by the EU. And again, it's quite surprising to many because it links Finland, which also doesn't have a pilgrimage tradition since the Reformation. And so these routes are being sponsored by Europe Union to support notions of European unity. And you see there's an interesting one because it combines both walking across land and also crossing water. So it brings together very nicely land pilgrimage and maritime pilgrimage. So next slide. And just across the water in the Baltic states, again, there's been an important revival of pilgrimage in Latvia and Estonia, which again was shaped very much by the Protestant Reformation. Lithuania is very interesting because, like Ireland, it retained its devotion to the Catholic Church, and this very iconic Hill of Crosses was a kind of place of resistance to secular socialist regimes that were established in Lithuania after the Second World War. But very interesting enough, caminos are being deliberately invented to link Lithuania with the other Baltic states, with Estonia and Latvia. And of course, the idea is that you waymark the routes with the cockle shell to remind people that it all ends up in northern Spain at Compostela. Actually, while we're talking about Compostela, some people don't go to Santiago. They prefer to go to Finisterre, where they ceremoniously burn their boots. And so it's an interesting take on where you end, where is your destination, where is your ending point in this long journey. So I think we're now coming to the last slide. Yeah, so conclusion then. Clearly, this talk has tried to describe the increasing numbers of routes to pilgrimage shrines in contemporary Europe. These routes attract people who want to walk for one or more days. I've been involved in 2 one-day walks organised by the British Pilgrimage Trust, which is a very interesting online, largely virtual operation involving only about 3 staff, actually, which is a sign of the kind of new ways that pilgrimage can be organised by mobile phone and GPS and all those kinds of access to virtual communication. So pilgrimage clearly attracts people in a variety of ways. Some want to, like me, want to go for just one day. Other people want to make 2 or 3 days, or in the case of the Camino, you might spend 2 weeks or more doing it. So there's a great range of options, if you like, which is of course very attractive, increases the numbers of people doing it. Second point, clearly, is increasing diversity of pilgrimage. So we've now talk about perhaps religious, spiritual, military, secular. I co-edited a book on military pilgrimage, which again hasn't really been discussed very much. People have talked about visits to battlefield sites in terms of so-called battlefield tourism, but there's also a strong tradition of military pilgrimage as well. Third point, there's clearly a mixture of motives for visiting shrines, and that's the job of people like me, anthropologists, to try and explore this great complexity, rich complexity, really, rather than just assuming that people are doing it for one motive. And of course, as I mentioned before, people may change their motives over time during their life course. So going in their 20s might be very different from going in their 40s or their 60s. Destinations, of course, are still important. So it's easy to overdo the notion of the journey. It's become quite trendy to talk about the journey rather than destination, but of course people want to go to so-called special places, these numinous places, sacred places, whatever you might like to call them. And as we've seen at the beginning of the talk, millions of people still come to these destinations. And the final point, I think, is an interesting issue of authenticity. Many people debate what a pilgrimage should be, kind of normative version. Should we, is flying to Lourdes, for example, part of the pilgrimage? Is it too easy? If you go by Ryanair, it probably isn't very easy. Should you drive there? Should you cycle? So are cyclists pilgrims? Or are the only real pilgrims the walkers, those with the blisters and the battered coats and stuff like that? Is it authentic to buy stuff in the shops? Should people be drinking as well as praying at the destination? So our job is not to say which is right and which is wrong, but clearly to reflect on the ways in which people think about pilgrimage in terms of these notions of authenticity. Okay, and that's really as far as I've got. Thank you very much.
Thanks very much, John. That was brilliant. Really enjoyable. Thank you very much. I'm sure there's a few questions. So